Kyle Clifford, on the 9th of July last year, you went to the home of your former girlfriend, Louise Hunt, and launched a murderous attack on her and her family. You first killed her mother, Carol, who even on that day showed you nothing but kindness in the moments before you attacked her. You raped and killed Louise, who had been as gentle as she could in ending her relationship with you after your arrogance and anger proved too much for her to stand. Then you murdered Hannah Hunt, who had done nothing to harm you save supporting her little sister. The evidence I have heard shows you to be a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, a man who holds women in utter contempt. This is no occasion to subject the family and friends of your victims to any delay or suspense. I therefore make clear at once that for each of these 3 murders, the sentence will be one of life imprisonment with a whole life order. That means a sentence from which you will never be released. Your brutal and cowardly attack had been planned over about 11 days. You conducted extensive research into the movements of Louise's father, John, into her mother's Facebook page, into buying a crossbow, a knife and an air pistol, and even into the weather on the day of the attack. You bought rope, duct tape, petrol cans, the knife you used in the attack, and a crossbow. You wrote letters to your family dripping with self-pity. On the day of the attack, you first parked well away from the Hunt family home to check if Louise's father was there. Researching his work when you saw his car was indeed outside the house. You approached a second time with a bag of Louise's clothes and a thank you card to Carol and John Hunt, obviously part of a plan to trick Mrs. Hunt into letting you in the house. You first talked to Carol Hunt on the doorstep and persuaded her to admit you. She spoke kindly to you, but you then attacked her, stabbing her to death within moments of entering. You then left the house to collect the crossbow. Louise Hunt had been working in a building in the garden of the house. When she came in, you restrained her with duct tape round her wrists and ankles and gagged her. You kept her there alive for over 2.5 hours. She must have come to realise you'd already killed her mother. During that time, you raped her. Then you murdered her by shooting her with the crossbow as her sister Hannah was about to enter the house. Hannah Hunt was in a rush. She saw you and realised something was very wrong. You then shot her with the crossbow, causing an injury she could never hope to survive, but she remained alive long enough to see the unspeakable violence you had already inflicted on her mother and her sister. Hannah was able to call for help, but when the emergency services arrived, they could not save her. You had fled. You were arrested the next day, whereupon you made a last-minute attempt to kill yourself. I have heard John Hunt, Amy Hunt and Alex Klein speak of their dreadful loss. They were difficult to listen to, given the devastation and heartbreak they recounted. They spoke of Carol, Louise and Hannah as bringing joy, colour and happiness into the lives of everyone they knew. They were funny, hard-working and caring people. Each precious life, so full of potential, of future successes and celebrations, torn away by your appalling violence. The statements of John and Amy Hunt also demonstrated great courage and determination that your terrible crimes will not define them or stop them leading the lives that Carol, Louise and Hannah Hunt would have wished for them. they showed a gentle heroism of which you, Kyle Clifford, can only dream. I've already announced the ultimate sentence I will impose. I now need to set out the technical legal reasoning behind the sentences I have decided upon. To deal with lesser matters, I will impose concurrent terms of 1 year's imprisonment for counts 1 and 2, the possession of the crossbow and the possession of the knife. I choose those sentences on the basis of category A2 under the Sentencing Council guidelines, with the aggravation of their planned use and the threat to the crossbow posed to police officers on the 10th of July. The only mitigation is your lack of previous convictions and, to a limited extent, your age. After a trial, the sentence would have been 15 months, but I deduct 20% for your guilty plea well before trial. The surcharge provisions apply and the order can be drawn up accordingly. I make the order for the deprivation of the items on the list uploaded onto the digital case system by the prosecution, including the crossbow, your laptop and phone. The proper sentence for rape is guided by the Sentencing Council. I find the rape of Louise Hunt to fall into the highest range of the top category 1A for the reasons identified by the prosecution. There is no element of double counting, as I have to impose a concurrent sentence given the nature of the sentence for the murders. I therefore take the upper end of the range of 19 years. There is mitigation in your lack of previous convictions, but serious aggravation in the planning of the crime. I will therefore pass a sentence of 20 years imprisonment for that offence. There are no Sentencing Council guidelines currently in force for the offence of false imprisonment, and the circumstances of that offence are so intertwined with the murders that it is hard to separate them. But in any event, it has to be concurrent to the life sentences, so double counting and totality are not issues. Louise Hunt's detention was prolonged, planned, in her own home, and it falls within the Sentencing Council definition of domestic abuse. For this offence, you are also entitled to a deduction for your guilty plea. I therefore pass a sentence after that 20% reduction of 8 years imprisonment. Guidance on the imposition of the mandatory life sentence custodial term is set out in Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act 2020. A whole life order is normally to be imposed for the murder of 2 or more people where each murder involves a substantial degree of premeditation or planning. Such a disposal is a rare one and reserved for only the most extreme cases. I have considered the guidance of the Court of Appeal in the decisions of Stewart and others, of Kigundu and Osborne. I will not add to the length of these remarks by rehearsing what is set out with great clarity in those judgments, save to highlight 2 points. First, Schedule 21 must be applied in a flexible, not rigid way to achieve a just result. Second, that although paragraph 2.2 of that schedule may have had in mind 2 murders planned, then committed on separate occasions, those provisions do not exclude the most severe order being made for multiple killings on the same day. I am satisfied so that I am sure that you both planned and contemplated killing all 3 of your victims. I've already mentioned your planning. You knew the routine and habits of that household. You clearly anticipated that Carol Hunt would be in the house as you went equipped to trick your way inside. You must have known Louise Hunt would be working in the building in the garden, as you knew her routine, and she was the obvious target to be raped and murdered. You knew the routines of the household. You were there for over 4 hours and must have anticipated that Hannah Hunt would return. While you had used Louise Hunt's phone to ensure John Hunt would not be home any time soon, you made no such inquiry about Hannah. You would have known she wore a uniform for work, which she would be bound to come home to change before doing anything else in the evening. I am sure that Hannah too was part of your premeditation and that you intended to murder her if the chance presented itself. Those findings alone could lead to the imposition of a whole life term, but there are 4 further very serious aggravating factors. First, the relevant section of the schedule is triggered by, quote, the murder of 2 or more persons, I stress, or more. It seems to me the fact there were, quote, more, unquote, must be a relevant factor for a judge to have in mind. Otherwise, the courts would be saying the murder of 3 people added nothing to the sentence for the murder of 2, an unthinkable proposition. Second, the rape of Louise Hunt, of which the jury found you guilty last week, which offence was part of the same plan and the same course of conduct as the 3 killings. Third, these murders took place against a woman with whom you had been in an intimate relationship and her family, and so is within the Sentencing Council guidance on domestic abuse, which context makes crimes even more serious. Fourth, the murders of Louise and Hannah Hunt must have involved them becoming aware of the murders you had already committed, thereby inflicting dreadful mental suffering before death, a specified aggravating factor under the schedule. You have been referred to at times as a former soldier. In many cases, that would serve as significant mitigation. Not so in your case, however, as your 2 years in the army included 286 days at home claiming to be ill. You never saw active service, and your utility to the armed forces can be gleaned in a parting comment from your commanding officer that, quote, his character is wholly unsuited to military employment, and he has no care nor concern beyond himself, unquote. There are 3 matters of mitigation. First, your lack of previous convictions. Second, your relative youth, though you were already 26 years old by the time of these offences. Third, you pleaded guilty to the offences of murder, though not at the first opportunity. I have reflected on all 3 aspects. The Sentencing Council guidance makes clear there may be cases where a guilty plea should lead the court to draw back from imposing a whole life order. I have considered and rejected that course, as the factors in favour of such an order are so compelling that they far outweigh all those pieces of mitigation. I am left in no doubt that this is a sentence I must impose. The sentences I pass are therefore: for possession of an offensive weapon, the crossbow, 1 year's imprisonment, concurrent. For the possession of an offensive weapon, the knife, 1 year's imprisonment, concurrent. For the murder of Carol Hunt, life imprisonment with a whole life order, the early release provisions are not to apply. For the false imprisonment of Louise Hunt, 8 years imprisonment, concurrent. For the rape of Louise Hunt, 20 years imprisonment, concurrent. For the murder of Louise Hunt, life imprisonment with a whole life order. The early release provisions are not to apply. For the murder of Hannah Hunt, life imprisonment with a whole life order. The early release provisions are not to apply. I thank Karen.
Well, that is Judge Joel Benathan passing sentence on Kyle Clifford, a man who killed 3 women in Bushey, Hertfordshire, last summer. The judge sentencing Clifford to a whole life order, life in prison for each of the murders. The judge saying, while passing that sentence, this means you will never be released. He described Clifford as a jealous man, soaked in self-pity, who the judge said holds women in utter contempt. Let's bring in our crime correspondent, Martin Brunt, who has been following this case for us. And Martin, the sentence there, a whole life term, for Clifford, the judge saying he will never be released.
That's right, no chance of parole. And I think that sentence was inevitable. I mean, he rather ticked all the boxes that make killers particularly qualified for whole life sentences. And the judge spent a few minutes explaining that. I mean, the fact that there was more than one murder, the fact that he used extreme violence, the mental torture he'd put through Louise and Hannah before he killed them, because the judge felt that they almost certainly knew that their mother had already been murdered. The judge did say that he looked at some mitigating factors that might have reduced that whole life order to a fixed term. The fact that Kyle Clifford had no previous convictions, the fact that he was relatively young, he was only 26 when he committed the murders, and the fact that he'd pleaded guilty to all of the crimes except the rape of Louise, for which he was found guilty after a trial last week. But the judge said he felt that all the aggravating factors, the multiple murders, the sexual element, the rape of Louise, the fact that this could be described as domestic abuse because he'd been in a relationship with Louise Hunt, and the mental torture that he'd inflicted because the two younger women knew that their mother had already been killed. All of that, he said, outweighed any mitigation that he might have given him and reduced that whole life sentence to a sentence of a number of fixed years. Of course, Kyle Clifford wasn't there. He'd refused to attend his trial last week. He refused to come and listen to the sentencing and to those very dramatic impact statements from members of the Hunt family. But clearly that sentence will be relayed to him in Belmarsh prison, where he's insisted on staying in his cell. I imagine that he probably too anticipated that he would face the rest of his life in prison.
Indeed. And Martin, we got a little bit from the judge as well, as you point out, about this man, Kyle Clifford. The judge opening his sentencing remarks, describing him as jealous, soaked in self-pity, someone who holds women in utter contempt. We also heard a note from the discharging officer when Clifford was in the army, the judge disparaging, referring to him as a former soldier, saying that doesn't really count because of the 2 years plus that you spent in the army. You spent 200 days pretending to be ill.
Yes, I mean, he was suggesting that, you know, as a former soldier, perhaps he might be given some leniency, but we heard from the prosecutor this morning that his 2 years in the army was pretty disastrous. And there were a number of testimonies read out by the prosecutor about his lack of ambition, his self-obsession, and indeed that extraordinary amount of time that he claimed to be sick. And, you know, almost half that army career was spent at home, claiming that he was ill. So the judge, I suppose, you know, making it very clear how exactly he arrived at that quite rare decision to give him a whole life sentence. I mean, there are only something like 70 people in UK prisons in England and Wales who are subject to whole life sentences. They include the nail bomber David Copeland, Lucy Letby, the nurse convicted of those murders of babies in a Cheshire hospital, and Rosemary West, the wife of Fred West, who was convicted of 10 murders in the infamous Cromwell Street House of Horrors murders in Gloucester in the mid-90s. So he joins that very dubious rank of 70 or so prisoners who will never be released.
And Martin, he also joins the list of men who have killed women who have then, on sentencing and during parts of their trial, refused to come up to court to hear their punishment. And I guess it will again raise questions about how these people who are convicted of these kind of egregious crimes can be made to face the justice inside the courtroom?
Well, simply they can't be made to do it unless you want to drag somebody shouting and screaming into a courtroom. But what does that achieve? If somebody is so determined not to be there and resists being manhandled or tries to resist, even if they are manhandled into court, you know, what's going to stop them shouting and screaming unless they are strapped tightly and gagged? And I guess that's such an invidious image to have in front of a courtroom. I mean, in this case, it would have been more problematic. The judge, Mr. Justice Benathan, was very clear, not just today but last week, saying that he wanted Clifford to be here. And he'd talked to governors at Belmarsh Prison asking about getting him here, or at least getting him in front of a video link. The problem in this particular case is that Kyle Clifford is in a wheelchair. He's paralysed from the waist down after trying to kill himself with a crossbow just before his arrest last summer. That he had to be treated differently, and the idea, and the judge accepted this, the idea of trying to restrain a man in a wheelchair and get him in front of a video screen, or indeed bring him to court many miles from Belmarsh Prison, was really something that the judge thought he couldn't insist on. So that's why Clifford wasn't here. But I think more or less the same reasons would apply to anybody else who, you know, it's thought could be restrained and brought to a courtroom. I really just don't think it's going to happen. And we do know, of course, that, you know, there is an argument that the criminal should be there to see justice handed down to him or her. And we heard from John Hunt today when he gave his impact statement, very powerful statement this morning, explaining the impact that these murders had had on him, losing 3/4 of his family, as he said. He'd intended and wanted and thought he would be able to deliver that eye to eye, he said, with Clifford, but he was robbed of that opportunity as well.
Indeed. And Martin, we are awaiting the lead officer in this case, DCI Nick Gardner, who is due to give a statement outside court where you are there in Cambridge, and of course we'll bring viewers that as and when it begins. But Martin, you talked about those victim impact statements, what we heard from John Hunt and from Hannah and Louise's sister, Amy. And the power of those is always remarkable. It's always a profound moment when you hear the victim impact statements. But as the judge made clear that those statements and what we heard really had little impact on the judge's sentencing because of the egregious nature, the premeditation of these crimes.
Yes, I mean, the judge said that he acknowledged the statements. He said that it was difficult to listen to them sometimes. And it's not so much for the judge to take them on board as part of the sentencing. It's really for the victims to make it clear exactly the impact that whatever the crime is has had on them. And it's not always obvious. Even when you've sat through, you know, a very detailed, long trial, you know, it's sometimes difficult to grasp exactly how that has affected those that have been left behind. So it was important that they were given the opportunity to deliver those statements. And not everybody delivers them in person, but it was noticeable when John Hunt looked very confident as he walked across the courtroom into the dock and started talking, that this was a moment. I mean, he said it was an opportunity to lay out exactly the effect that these murders had had on him and his family. And it was very powerful. And I suppose, you know, particularly in his case, he is by profession a broadcaster. I'm not suggesting he found it easy to say those words, but he certainly had a confidence that added, I think, to the impact and emotion of the words that he said.
And Martin, During the trial, the prosecution pointed out towards the end of this that on the day of the killings, Kyle Clifford had viewed the content online of Andrew Tate, a self-styled misogynist, the prosecution saying that the violent misogyny promoted by Tate fueled Clifford's attacks. Will there be some time now after this to look into some of that online misogyny and in this particular instance, how it may well have impacted this individual and perhaps been a part of the crimes that they later committed?
Well, Andrew Tate and to some extent his brother Tristan are, the subject of ongoing legal proceedings in Romania and in the UK. They are wanted in the UK because of allegations made by a number of women about their sexual behaviour, and there are moves in the United States to pursue them over similar claims. So the Tate brothers are in an awful lot of trouble, potential trouble at least, although they deny all the claims that are made about them. I think this case does highlight their presence online in particular, and there perhaps will be calls. I think let's listen to the officer and the Crown Prosecutor. Let's listen to as close as you can. The officer and the Crown Prosecutor.
Ready? I am Detective Chief Inspector Nick Gardner from the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Hertfordshire Major Crime Unit. I would firstly like to pay tribute to the Hunt family, John and Amy, and Hannah's partner Alex. They have suffered unimaginable loss as a result of Clifford's actions. They have shown dignity and strength of courage throughout the investigation and trial. And although the sentence will provide little or no consolation, at least we know that Clifford will never be released from prison. Today, Clifford received a whole life sentence, which is fitting for the appalling nature of his crimes. Clifford showed once again that he is a coward. Despite overwhelming forensic evidence, he pleaded not guilty to rape. He refused to attend court for his trial or to hear his punishment. Aged just 26, Clifford has many years ahead of him to consider the consequences of his crime and the senseless devastation he has brought to others. I would like to thank my investigation team for their tireless work and dedication in bringing this case to court. Ultimately, it is their hard work, as well as the evidence secured by officers who attended in the initial response, that has resulted in today's sentence. I would also like to thank the many officers from Hertfordshire Constabulary, the Metropolitan Police Service and the City of London Police who were involved in the initial response to this horrific crime. Clifford was clearly a dangerous man, and these officers acted with immense bravery, knowing that he was likely armed and had killed 3 people just hours earlier. I would like to thank counsel for the prosecution and the Crown Prosecution Service, who we have worked closely together with throughout the duration of this case. 3 innocent women from the same family lost their lives simply because Clifford could not accept rejection or Louise's right to leave their relationship. There was nothing that Louise, Carol or Hannah could have done to predict the violence that ensued or to prevent it from happening. They resisted Clifford's attack with bravery, and Hannah herself raised the alarm, despite having suffered an injury that would later take her life. Today's sentence sends a message to men who perpetrate serious acts of violence against women. You will be held accountable, and you will face the full force of the law. You can run, but you cannot hide from justice. Thank you.
I'm Lisa Kiff from the Crown Prosecution Service. Kyle Clifford is a murderer and rapist who at every turn has attempted to escape the gravity of his actions. From seeking to evade arrest to not attending his trial or the sentencing hearing today, his lack of remorse and accountability for the truly inhumane crimes he has committed has been laid bare. While Clifford pleaded guilty to the murders of Carol, Louise and Hannah Hunt, the Crown Prosecution Service took the decision to proceed with the rape charge. This was to ensure full justice was secured for Louise and to ensure that Clifford could be sentenced for the full extent of his offending. That decision has been vindicated by his conviction for the rape and by the sentence passed today, as Clifford will never be released from prison. On behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service, I want to express my heartfelt sympathies and admiration to the Hunt family. They had the strength and courage to attend court every day and hear firsthand the devastating truth of what happened to Carol, Hannah and Louise, something which, in stark contrast, Clifford was too cowardly to do. We hope today's sentence, which ensures Clifford can never hurt anyone again, can help the Hunt family with their healing process as they navigate the future and continue to honour the lives of Carol, Louise and Hannah. Thank you.
Well, that was Lisa Kiff there, a senior prosecutor with the Crown Prosecution Service. And before Ms Kiff, we heard from DCI Nick Gardner, the senior investigator in the case. The prosecutor there, Lisa Kiff, saying at the end that she hopes this sentence will allow for the Hunt family to heal and carry on with the rest of their lives. And from DCI Nick Gardner, we also heard a tribute to the Hunt family for their bravery and the work that they had done during this trial and for the pain they've had to go through. And DCI Gardner also said that there was a message in this case to men who commit violence against women, that you will be held accountable, you cannot run and you cannot hide from justice. Well, let's bring in our crime correspondent Martin Brunt, who is still there for us outside Cambridge Crown Court. Martin, we heard from the officer in charge of this and from the CPS. The CPS saying they felt vindicated by their choice to go for that rape charge, which Clifford was found guilty of last week. Talk to us a little bit, if you can, Martin, about some of the investigation that the police carried out, because we heard in the judge's sentencing remarks quite detailed evidence that the police had been able to get hold of in terms of Clifford's movements in the days before the killing.
Yes, I think the police clearly felt it was important to establish the meditation, and the planning that Clifford had gone through. And I think they wanted to show that this was not something that he did off the cuff in a so-called moment of madness. It was very clear from the evidence that they managed to put together that he had spent the best part of 2 weeks planning what he eventually did. And there was some pretty firm evidence to corroborate that. Viewers might remember the CCTV footage that we showed last week that was shown to the jury. Within a day or so of being dumped by Louise Hunt, it appeared that Kyle Clifford had decided to embark on this terrible wave of violence. He was buying gaffer tape in a DIY store, tape that was eventually used to restrain Louise Hunt before he raped her. He was buying rope that police believe, and there was some images of this that showed her he'd tied together a noose. Whether that was for one of his victims or for himself, it's not clear. It was found in the woods where he was finally arrested. Perhaps a possible attempt to kill himself, but it didn't go any further than that. There was other CCTV footage that showed him buying cans, petrol cans, that the police believed he could have used to perhaps destroy the scene of his crimes at the Hunt household. They picked up on his use of his mobile phone and the searches he was doing on the internet, and in fact the things he bought. The crossbow was bought on Amazon via the internet, and so too was the butchery knife, as it was described in court. So police were able to show through tracking back over his movements those 2 weeks before the murders that was exactly what he had in mind. Martin Brunt for us there outside at Cambridge Crown Court.
following the sentencing to a whole life order of Kyle Clifford for the murders of Louise and Hannah Hunt and Carol Hunt in Bushey last summer. The judge saying that Mr. Clifford will never be released from prison.